Why do we watch films? Some may say that we do so simply to be entertained, but that's like saying we eat food just because it tastes good. It's a superficial answer. The reality is that we eat food to be nourished. The same goes for stories. Sure, they can entertain us and provide amusement, but in essence, stories are nourishment for our souls. Like food, which revitalizes our cells and fuels bodily functions, stories revitalize the soul and fuel the functions of the spirit, which include the way we treat one another and orient ourselves in the world. And like our bodies, which thrive on the nutrients of healthy food, so too do our souls thrive on the narrative nutrients of great stories. In this video, I will explore why DreamWorks Animation's groundbreaking 1998 film, The Prince of Egypt, stands out in stark contrast to the majority of animated films, and what it can teach us about storytelling at a time when we find ourselves saturated in sedative entertainment and shallow narrative content, which distracts us from life's great truths rather than preparing us for the inevitable collision they will have with our lives. The Prince of Egypt is an adaptation of the Book of Exodus from the Bible. The film tells the story of Moses, who was born a Hebrew in ancient Egypt, and hunted down along with all newborns by Egyptian guards tasked with reducing the growing slave population. In a desperate attempt to save her son, Moses' mother puts him in a basket and sends him down the Nile River. After being discovered by the Pharaoh's wife, Moses is raised as a prince of Egypt and enjoys a lavish life, totally disconnected from his roots and his people. One night, as a young man, Moses encounters his biological sister and brother. Upon hearing the lullaby his mother sang to him as a baby, he is compelled to acknowledge his Hebrew origins. This revelation ultimately leads to his departure from Egypt and sets Moses on a course to encounter God in the wilderness, where he is told to save his people from the bondage of slavery and deliver them to the promised land. The story of the Prince of Egypt is unlike most of its animated counterparts, since it deals in realistic subject matter that is historical and deeply spiritual. It represents a breakaway from many of the comparatively more trivial animated films which were produced in the same decade. To understand why the Prince of Egypt is such an outlier, let's unpack how attitudes to storytelling have changed over the centuries, particularly in the modern era, which has seen an unprecedented acceleration in the development of these trends. While in centuries past, narratives were sacred, interwoven into spiritual life, and functioned much like a fuel source for human activity and a compass for moral behavior, today we find ourselves as citizens of a morally complacent, pleasure-driven, scientific, corporate society, which has commodified and cheapened stories, and in the process, distanced itself from their sacred, transcendent power. As a result, we find ourselves saturated in trivial entertainment, designed with the express purpose of turning a profit, while the great stories that guided our ancestors for centuries and anchored our culture to its history are slowly being forgotten. Stories traditionally had more gravitas because they ambitiously attempted to account for our place in the cosmos by connecting us to a greater power beyond ourselves. The dynamics of this relationship are reflected in their construction, tone, and focus. The stories in the Bible are a perfect example of this. The biblical stories were passed down to help humans orient themselves in a chaotic, violent world and ultimately commune with the source of all creation to achieve spiritual salvation. One must remember that in the ancient world where many of our great stories originate from, the stakes were high and despair was part of everyday life. The utility of stories was therefore profound, as they cultivated hope and shone a light in what must have been an unspeakably dark period of human history. Unlike the ancient world, the modern world is one of comfort and relative safety, where the stakes are remarkably low and the market for hope has been replaced by the market for pleasure. The darkness of despair that plagued our ancestors has been illuminated for the most part due to countless human achievements, tragic wars, and hard-won lessons. As beneficiaries of an illuminated world who have been spared the pain of the ancient era, we now no longer seek light the way we used to. Instead, we have turned our attention towards the pursuit of pleasure and profit, which we seek to experience while complacently taking for granted the miraculous light of progress which we owe to the struggles of our ancestors. Establishing this historical background helps in understanding the context in which many films, both animated and live action, are produced. Consider how the vast majority of animated films are so amusing, colorful, feature talking animals, are aimed at young audiences, generally light in tone and devoid of content that demands too much from its audience. While of course many of these films contain memorable stories, their characteristics are clearly the result of market preferences, which tend to favor experiences that trigger pleasure as opposed to genuine insight and reflection. If we go to the movies to escape from life as opposed to engage with it, we shouldn't be surprised that so many animated movies operate on such a superficial level that fails to address the profound mysteries of the human spirit, connect us to our history, or teach us valuable moral lessons we may not always want to hear. This is why the arrival of The Prince of Egypt in 1998 represents such a powerful landmark in animated filmmaking. Amidst a sea of whimsicality and light-hearted entertainment, The Prince of Egypt surfaced as an island of potent narrative solemnity, which delivered a truly unique, never-before-seen cinematic experience. While live-action films depicting biblical stories were fairly numerous before its release, an animated interpretation of a biblical story on the scale of The Prince of Egypt simply had no precedent. After all, animation was, and still is in many ways, considered by most people to be a medium best suited for young audiences, particularly children. On top of this, major animation studios like Disney had no interest in telling biblical epics, since they had found a successful formula with their fairy tales, and most likely didn't want to take the risk of venturing into more serious historical territory. This is evidenced by the fact that Jeffrey Katzenberg, who co-founded DreamWorks, had wanted to make an animated adaptation of a biblical story for years while working as a chairman of Disney. However, after suggesting the idea to Michael Eisner, the Disney CEO at the time, and failing to get Eisner's approval, Katzenberg realized he would have to wait. Katzenberg's dream was revived after he left Disney and co-founded DreamWorks in 1994. The company was founded by Katzenberg alongside music producer David Geffen and director Steven Spielberg. During a meeting between the three, during the early days of the company's formation, Katzenberg recalls the moment when the idea took root. "I didn't want us to tell fairy tales. I wanted us to try pick an interesting dramatic epic, embracing all the techniques of animation." Steven sort of thought about it for a couple of seconds, and then he leaned forward and said, "Well, why don't we do the 10 Commandments?" And after my jaw hit my lap, I said, "Well, what a fabulous idea. It's just an amazing story that deserves to be told." Considering the attitudes to animation at the time and the fact that most animated films up until that point were based in the realm of explicit fantasy and geared towards escapism, the bold vision behind The Prince of Egypt is all the more inspiring. When interviewed during the production of the film, director Simon Wells said, "Because it's so different from anything that's been done before, no one else would dare touch it." What makes The Prince of Egypt so different from anything that was done before is the fact that it wasn't born out of a superficial desire to simply amuse and entertain, but rather a heartfelt wish to share one of the foundational stories in Western culture and challenge audiences with solemn depictions of historical events. In this sense, The Prince of Egypt was produced in the same tradition as the grand stories that preceded the rise of trivial entertainment. In other words, instead of thinking about what would be most profitable, DreamWorks considered what would be most meaningful. This move was, and still remains, a breath of fresh air in the world of animated storytelling. The Prince of Egypt is also notably different from most other animated films in that it was an expensive, large-scale animated film directed more at adults than children. Don't get me wrong, The Prince of Egypt is a family-friendly movie. Kids can still enjoy the movie and get a lot out of it. as I did when I first watched the film as a child. However, I consider it to be primarily an adult's movie, given the serious nature of the subject matter and the sacredness therein. I think the grand nature of the production is interesting because advanced animation is typically used to create magical worlds and fairy tales. However, in The Prince of Egypt, those engines of high-end animation power are used to depict a very real historical world and events which inform the faith of millions. To put into perspective just how big the production of The Prince of Egypt was, let's break down some key information. The film was produced on a budget of $70 million. It was directed by a trio of directors who oversaw a team of roughly 425 animators, artists, and technicians. Characters were voiced by an all-star cast which included Val Kilmer, Ralph Fiennes, Sandra Bullock, Jeff Goldblum, Helen Mirren, and Michelle Pfeiffer. The film's music was composed by the modern master Hans Zimmer, while lyrics were written by famed lyricist Stephen Schwartz. To top it all off, the team took on the enormous task of depicting realistic characters in a religiously sacred context, which demanded unusual levels of accuracy in terms of design, animation, and overall artistic output. It's no wonder production took a staggering 4 years to complete. In short, The Prince of Egypt was not only biblical in terms of story, but biblical in virtually every aspect of construction. Again, this wasn't a film about singing animals or characters you could make toys out of. This was a film about a story from the Bible, and one of the greatest stories at that. The fact that this film was made at all is something of a miracle. To make clearer the distinction between the great stories of human culture and trivial entertainment, I want you to imagine a group of people sitting around a fire under the night sky between two great mountains in a valley. One half of the circle is listening to a young man telling a funny story about how he watched his friend fall out of a tree while looking for fruit to eat. The story is light, amusing, and distracts the listeners from their troubles. On the other side of the circle, a more serious story is underway. An old man is telling the story of how the tribe arrived at the valley and settled between the mountains many years ago. The old man recounts the bravery of their ancestors, who overcame immense obstacles to find a safe area to settle. Instead of laughing, the old man's audience engages with the story by reflecting on their own courage. They also quietly experience gratitude as they consider the debt that they owe to their forefathers and the gift of the land that they were bestowed. The story gives them a sense of rootedness and history. It nourishes their souls. What I hope to demonstrate with this imaginary situation are the two types of stories told around the proverbial fire. The first being the light stories about trivial events which are told for the sake of amusement and distraction, what I like to think of as junk food stories, and the second being stories about how we arrived at the fire, which are told for the sake of wisdom and engagement. I like to think of these as healthy stories. To put it as simply as possible, there are stories we tell about society, and then there are stories we tell about how we created society. The stories about how we created society will always be more significant because they form the trunk of the tree from which every other narrative branches off from. The Prince of Egypt matters because it tells the story of that trunk, not just for Israel, but for much of the Western world and perhaps even the territories beyond it. The Exodus from Egypt is the archetypal story of man's perpetual struggle against tyranny, the importance of hope and belief in a greater power, and the overwhelming struggles that have to be undertaken to leave everything you know and start anew. While on the surface the Exodus story is historically about the Jews, I believe the story speaks to the reality of every human being. Egypt is the archetypal tyrannical state. The Jews are the archetypal victims, and Moses is the archetypal leader, called by a greater power to deliver his people to the promised land. Are these not the ingredients we find in the birth of virtually every new society, no matter the size? Going one step further, are these not the ingredients we find in ourselves? After all, within us we find ourselves caught between Egypt and a promised land, that is, what we are and what we could be if we realized our full potential. And like Moses, so too are our individual spirits, called by a voice that cries out to us from the wilderness, beckoning us to set aside our mortal fears and trust in the voice which we do not always understand, but know to be real and true. Call it your conscience, the universe, or God. Regardless, it is a voice beyond one's own. The Prince of Egypt matters because it tells one of the greatest, if not the greatest, stories of human culture. With breathtaking animation, it enables us to experience the emotional reality of events which underpin the belief of millions in the West and beyond. Unlike the deluge of modern, profit-driven storytelling, which often seems like it has a sedative effect, the Prince of Egypt meaningfully engages us by reconnecting us to a grander, more somber style of storytelling, which challenges us to pay attention and reflect, as opposed to mindlessly switch off and disconnect from reality. The Prince of Egypt tells the ultimate story of how we arrived at the proverbial fire, and it does so in magnificent fashion. At this point in time, it appears our society is much like those people sitting around the fire, wanting to hear more trivial stories about people falling out of trees. While there is of course a time and a place for amusement, we ignore the stories of our origins at our peril, for they contain the wisdom we will need if we have any hope of challenging the inevitable return of tyranny and heeding the call from the voice that calls us to the promised land. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please support this channel by liking, sharing, and subscribing. This is In Depth Annie. Thanks for watching.